Hello. Whee! And it's on there. Good. Hello, Oslo. Try again. Hello, Oslo. Are you all asleep from having lunch? How did you say yes then? Yeah. Anyway, hopefully you're all in the right talk. Always do the what is the point of Microsoft is this talk. Make sure you're not in the wrong room. I'm Liam Westley. I'm head of engineering at Huddle. Used to be an application architect till last year, and I ran the desktop, mobile teams, plus any data warehouse, plus security, so everything else the other architects weren't dealing with, pretty much. But it gave me a view on multi-platforms and multi-vendor stuff. And this kind of came from that. There's a program on the BBC back in the UK as a radio series that asks, what's the point of various things? They've done Formula One. They've done something called the Church of England that we have. Michelin stars for restaurants, things like that. And tried to work out whether really should these things exist anymore? Are they old-fashioned? Are they anachronistic? And do we need them anymore? So the question is, if Microsoft hasn't got this inherent right to exist, where is it strongest? Where are the weak points? And why should you care as a developer? Who uses Microsoft technologies as developers? There you are. So you might care about whether Microsoft is going to survive in the future because you kind of have a career in that area, might have an interest. I hope you care about their future. Otherwise, it's a bit weird that you're using their tools. Who am I? I work at Huddle. I've said that. I cycle to work and do a bit of leisure cycling. So I do about 10,000 K a year commuting to work on the bicycle. So it allows me to eat lots of cheese. Because I run a cheese club at work. This, in a Mexican restaurant just near work, looks like a big tortilla chip. Is actually completely made of cheese. And you use it like a tortilla chip to dip in guacamole. I highly recommend it. Doctors do not highly recommend it. This is the important bit. I've got to do a disclaimer. For many years, I was an MVP from 2010 to 2017. It was coming up to renewal in 2017. I gave this presentation, what is the point of Microsoft in Poland, and I did not get renewed. These things, correlation is not causation. I don't think they're related. I made the joke while I was there saying I might not get renewed, and I didn't, but it's because I was no longer doing kind of stuff that Microsoft really cared about, and I wasn't evangelizing about their products, so it went to someone who was, actually doing things like the guy who builds the open source cake engine, build engine for that's C#. And he got it that year, so I was happy to hand it on to someone else. So I've been doing this talk every 2 years. So I thought I'd give it in 2015. And I did that in DDD SouthWest, which is a UK community conference that we have all around the country. And this happened to be in Bristol. In that year, Sepp Blatter resigned as head of FIFA. Remember bribery things? Greek were in financial crisis, whereas now they're okay. Apple launched iPhone 6s and the iPad Pro, and Apple Pay came out, so you could actually pay for things with an iPhone in the US and maybe in the UK, probably not in Norway at that point, because it took them ages to roll it out worldwide. And Microsoft launched the Lumia 950 and 950 XL and the Surface Book. One of these was more successful than the others. And at this point, .NET Core was just about a gleam in their eye. So that's what was happening. When I gave the talk in Bristol, in the next room, a guy called Mark Rendell was running this tool called probably Core. He was running something called dnx.exe with JSON files that did .NET in a very limited way in a Linux box, probably in a virtual machine because he didn't have Docker on his laptop at that point. He might have had Docker, I can't remember. If he did, no one understood what Docker was 4 years ago in that room. Then 2 years later, I was invited to Łódź to get .NET. President Trump got inaugurated. United Kingdom triggered Article 50. By March the 31st, we would be out of Europe. Yeah, Apple launched the iPhone X. Microsoft were launching the Surface laptop, first ever laptop, if you think about it, because the Surface Book was kind of detachable. And Windows 10 Mobile finally got killed off. That was it. No more development, only security patches. NDC Oslo, we're here now. United Kingdom has left the European Union, will leave might, who knows, God help me. I live in the country and I don't understand what's happening. So don't talk to me about it. I just would rant on for ages. Talk to Ian Cooper, he can rant on much better than me about Brexit. Interestingly, at E3 2 weeks ago, well, last week, Sony has teamed up with Microsoft to stream games. Has to be one of the more bizarre kind of groupings, and that's to go against Google's streaming games. And the last Windows 10 mobile patches will come out, which means I will finally have to ditch this phone and buy a bloody Samsung. Let's be honest, it'll be a pleasure, to be honest, I suspect. I'm just holding out. WhatsApp stops working at the end of the year on that phone, and that's me dead on that phone. So I'm going to go into a bit of history, because you've got to see where Apple came from and where Microsoft came from, maybe where some of the other guys came from. So when we talk about operating systems, the thing that most people know about is probably the IBM PC. There were a few beforehand, like the Apple II and things. IBM PC launched. They didn't have any software to run on it, and there were these guys called Microsoft who'd written a basic compiler, and it looked like they could write an operating system, because if you can write a basic compiler, you must be able to write an operating system. Kind of craziness. Run on a single floppy disk. It took 2 years later till it supported a hard drive. You know, that's how basic things were. And it all looked exciting and whizzy until 1984, when the Apple Mac came out from Apple. And you went, wow, now this is it. This is the thing. This had a mouse, it had windows, it had pointers, still only had a floppy disk and didn't have a hard drive, but my God, it worked really well. It's still black and white, but who cared? Because it was like nice and graphical. More hardware integration created the first laser printer, designed to work with an Apple Mac, using that OS. In 1989, Steve Jobs left Apple and created something called Next Step. I don't know if you know about that. They created an OpenStep OS. It was a chunk off Bartley Unix, I think. And that would eventually come back to a Mac as OS X. Eventually. It took a while. But by 1990, color had arrived in the terms of Windows 3, which was the first usable Windows, I would say, because I don't think it was usable before then. It follows the pattern of Microsoft on the third product is always the one that works. You know, it's just one of those things that they have a habit of doing. So they had color, windowing. DOS was running underneath, but hey, whatever. Mac OS 7, System 7, 91. A year later, brought color to Apple. 91, a guy called Linus Torvalds released version 0.01 of a Unix-like kernel called Linux, apparently, as source code only. It did take another 2 years before you had a proper distribution called Debian that you could install easily and didn't have to compile yourself. Windows 95 came in 95, oddly enough, and that was the fancy UI. It looked really good. By 2001, we got rid of DOS, and Windows XP had a proper 32-bit Windows operating system. So that's kind of how operating systems came along. And eventually, as I said, Mac OS became OS X. It was Next Step's operating system brought back in, and we got an actual proper kind of Linux or Unix flavor of operating system on a Mac. In applications, the killer application that came on Apple II was called VisiCalc. This allowed accountants to do what-if kind of processing. This is a game changer in accountancy world. This is what really sold personal computers. On the PC, it did come on, but they also, Lotus 123 came, and you had WordStar and WordPerfect. While accountants got excited about that, creatives got excited about, hey, Apple have made this thing called a laser printer. They have PostScript on the fonts available, and a company called Aldus made a desktop publishing system that could use all that, and that's where magazines and newspapers started being created. And it is still a creative tool, even now, from that start of the first ever laser printer. This is a very clear indication that what happens is, to sell an operating system, you needed to have the apps. Something that Microsoft understood then, but didn't understand with mobile operating systems many years later. is you need the apps on the operating system to sell the operating system. And what they did was go, we need to put Word onto Windows. So we need a word processor on Windows. We also need a spreadsheet, and they brought Excel over from a Mac. PowerPoint first existed on a Mac, and they brought it to Windows, and that became the Office bundle, and that was the juggernaut that was Office for many years to come. A load of competitors, while they were working on all this, people were working on something called, and I have to remember what it's called, OS2 with IBM was an operating system that was going to occur. And all the competitors were writing, like Lotus and WordPerfect, were creating their apps for that, while Microsoft went, I think we'll write it for our own operating system. And that's what won, because of the apps that were on it, realistically. In programming terms, which you guys may be more interested in 1983, one of the things I started programming in when I was young was Turbo Pascal on a PC. And it's created by someone called Anders Hallberg. And he created a Pascal compiler for NASCOM computers in 1981. Bill Gates hated him because it was really fast. And his BASIC was really slow because it was interpreted, but the Pascal was compiled. And a version of that type of Pascal was used to create the original Mac OS. So system-level components inside Mac OS were written in Pascal, and that were running the original Apple Macintosh devices. Which, by the way, proves that Pascal is a real language that can be used for real things, because a lot of the time it's considered a teaching language. Windows was still horrendous to program until Visual Basic 1. So now anyone can create a grey form with grey buttons and white text boxes and make it look really bloody boring, including probably your boss or an accountant. So real non-programmers could use that as well as programmers. Fortunately, by the time it was VB6, only real developers could use Visual Basic because it got very complicated. And that secured my job and stopped my boss trying to write applications in a TV company. In 1988, you've got Steve Jobs licensing Objective-C into Next. So we've got Visual Basic 1. About 4 years later, Java released the very first version of Java. Sun released Java, such that it could be used for applets in a website. It was originally an interactive TV set-top box language. And then it got ported over. They went, well, it hasn't worked on that. What can we use it on? We can use it on applets in a website. This was before Flash. This was the thing that Flash sorted, because Flash would solve everything and stop everything being clunky Java applets. Not true. And eventually, Java, someone worked out you could use it at the back end as well. And it became an enterprise programming language. And it actually fell out of favor in the web and finally found its place doing enterprise development on servers. And it became so ubiquitous in organizations that Microsoft said, our COM-based stuff, our Visual Basic, our Visual C++ isn't quite keeping up with Java. So we'll create this new thing. It's called .NET Framework. And what we'll do is we'll build on the work that Anders Hallberg did with J++. Anders Hallberg with more gray hair than the original Anders Hallberg photo, it has to be said. And that's when .NET came out. A year later, C# was given as a full ISO standard, so it could be developed externally by other people. It's effectively open sourcing how your language works. It took another 4 years before the core of Java was released as open source. And even then, they didn't release the Enterprise Edition as open source. And then Android, Inc., which got bought by Google in 2005, worked out that Java might be quite a cool thing to use on their Linux-based mobile operating system. And that's how that happened. By 2014, everyone realized Objective-C is a nightmare. Who's programmed in Objective-C? Who enjoyed programming in Objective-C? Right, yeah, so they introduced Swift, which is their answer to get rid of Objective-C. .NET Core was announced about the same time, 2014, as the real progress for .NET Framework. And you now have, after lawsuits from Oracle, Google saying that Kotlin is how you should develop on an Android and not Java. And that'll be Java out of Android within a few years. So that was development and operating systems. We also have cloud services. Hope everyone by now is actually really got something in the cloud running, because it's a very incredible resource. Having configured servers, having had to configure, servers and web servers and all sorts of things and have to worry about hardware, it's a relief when you move things in the cloud, and it costs about the same amount of money in someone else's problem. So Amazon realized that as well as selling stuff, they actually had machines that they used to sell stuff, and they could sell the stuff they had on those machines to other people. I think partly they thought, people buy stuff during the day and they don't buy it at night. And what can we do with all these machines at night? Why don't we resell them to people? That kind of idea. Not a bad idea. I'm not saying they were eco-warriors. I think it's more Jeff Bezos going, we have stuff that we're not using. We should use that. And we need to make money out of everything. So they exposed a load of their web services for searching the store. And then they decided, why don't we make whole chunks of the infrastructure, EC2, S3, and they both launched in 2006. And Google went, we've got loads of data centers. Why don't we do this? We've got App Engine, we've got cloud storage. Cloud storage came in 2010, App Engine was 2008. Microsoft absolutely crapped themselves, right? Let's be honest. And they said, we've got to announce something. We're going to announce at the same time Google release App Engine that we've got Azure, I can never say it properly, Azure. I'm very British at that point. And they announced it in 2008. You couldn't really use it till about 2010. There wasn't really the services in it that they pre-announced. But by 2012, they were supporting Linux and Python. So they were trying to catch up as fast as possible. And they did the biggest U-turn I think I've ever seen Microsoft do, in going, right, we need to adopt the cloud. And not only that, we need to love it, hug it, and push as much as we can into it. And they knew how to build data centers because they'd been doing it for quite a while. Just for themselves as a company, they had to build their own data centers to handle their own traffic. So the problem is, the reason we have all those cloud servers is because browsers have taken over. So you don't care about maybe the operating system as much. You get through quite a lot of, you go to quite a lot of things. So you get through things with apps. You also get through things with browsers. IE was the dominant thing. Everyone hated IE. Microsoft sat on its backside saying IE is good enough. Everyone can cope with that now. So Chrome came along. So we've now got to the position where Chrome has 62.7% of the market. The rest of the market is Safari. Anyone know what USC browser is? It's the browser in China. Oh, sorry. So I can't see from the light. It's the browser used on phones in China, so that the government can snoop on what you're browsing, probably. I couldn't possibly know because I haven't got one of them on my machine. Firefox, IE, and Edge. So you've got, this is the gateway to the web, and IE and Edge are nowhere, let's be honest. The interesting thing, if you do desktop, you see Safari disappears. Because no one uses Safari on a Mac to browse the internet. That would be insane. You use the Chrome, right? Let's be honest. It's hideous if you're going to do that. So it's quite interesting that Safari is only there because it's on mobile devices, but it still has 16% of the entire market just off mobile devices and iPads, which is quite impressive. Why people don't install Chrome on the iOS and use that, I don't know. The interesting stat, though, was in March 2017 is the point at which there was more internet usage from Android devices than all the Windows devices put together. So that meant Windows was now and also ran in accessing anything on the internet, and it's probably going higher since then. I think that might include app, internet access, as well as web. So it just shows you how the market has changed. While Microsoft was being investigated in antitrust for Windows and IE, it completely changed underneath them, and they didn't even realize to some extent. So we get to the list of the players in the market. So we're going to do market capitalization. One of the reasons I wanted to do this talk, it suddenly occurred to me that I should propose this talk to the NDC guys, was in December, Microsoft overtook Apple in its market valuation. And it has pretty much been ahead since the middle of December last year. And it's reached the $1 trillion mark of being market capitalization. So we have Apple selling hardware with good software and services thrown in. Google sells you to advertisers, well, your data. Microsoft sells software licenses and services and occasionally hardware if you're using an Xbox. Facebook sells you as well all your data because that's all it's interested in. It's not interested in whether it's a cat or your sister or whatever. It's interested in whether you can sell your sister something to do with your cat, or get your cat voted in your local election, something like that. I've just been to Gary Short's How to Steal an Election talk. And Amazon sells you actual real stuff, that gets delivered through the door that you can use. But to be honest, it doesn't make any money off that. It makes all the money off the cloud services. Amazon was very skillfully engineered to lose money, and then it absolutely lost the plot by starting AWS, and it started making money. However fast it tried to sink money into data centers, it still made money, which surprised everyone in the industry. Now, the interesting bit, when I said Apple sells hardware, 2015, this was more of a joke, is because hardware meant 70% of the revenue was iPhones. Now it's only 50% is iPhones, 10% is iPad, 10% is Mac, and 20% is now services. So Apple have had to get that services pushed up to counter the fact that they're selling less iPhones than they used to. That's because mobile devices are kind of getting to the point PCs got, where you bought one every 2 years in the old days, and then they became powerful enough that you haven't had to replace them. And the only thing that's crap about them is the battery, or the fact that you smash the screen. You could carry on using that device for a long time, and that gives a problem to Apple. So that's why they're moving into services like credit cards and banking. Now, that list might look a bit odd. By the way, market capitalization is if you had the price per share times how many shares that company has is the market capitalization. That's what it means. How much they're worth. If you bought all 100% of their stock, how much would it cost you? And there you see Microsoft's getting to $1.02 trillion. The reason they're in that order is because they're in the order they were in 2015. Apple was at 705. Google was at 370, has nearly doubled. Microsoft at 355 has nearly trebled. Facebook has doubled. And Amazon's the big beast, because that's gone up by 5. When I did this in 2015, Oracle was on the list at 180 billion. And now they're at 180 billion. They haven't budged in 4 years, because they've got exactly what their market is. They know what it is. They're not worth any more because they haven't managed to expand anything. And the only company in the top 10 who aren't IT is Berkshire Hathaway at about 504 billion. So there are really nothing other than IT companies in the top 10 anymore. But you're devs, you don't care about market capitalization unless you've had some Amazon shares. You'd be quite happy if you'd have bought some Amazon shares. Maybe they'd have done better than Bitcoin over the last year. Who knows? I don't know at which point you would ever have sold your Bitcoin because you were so worried about it being less than it was last year, or maybe more than it will be more in 2 months. But we care about things like frameworks, platforms. I hope we do. So languages, is it open source? Is it multi-platform? .NET framework. We probably don't care about Windows as much as we used to. In cloud services, what we're looking for is containerization and management. We've got other services like identity, machine learning, AI, databases. That's relational plus object plus distributed databases. They're all now becoming really easy services that we can just pull in. Has anyone had to set up an Elasticsearch cluster themselves? Yeah, was it easy? No. And now you can buy it off Amazon. And Amazon can just set it up for you and do all the things to do with clustering, scaling, and everything that you need to do. And this is real bonus for us, because we can actually sort out the business problems and leave the hard grunting to someone else. And as long as it makes sense money-wise, then you're fine. And it normally does. Mobile platform and web, it's now progressive web applications, bit of React, cross-platform, maybe XAMPP if it's in-house, Xamarin Forms. It's certainly not Windows Mobile. So Microsoft's philosophy was operating systems. Actually, their first thing was BASIC, a programming language. And that was why Steve Ballmer could get away with this video being public of him sweating in front of a stadium of developers, because they did care about developers. He genuinely cared about developers at that point, because he knew that it was developers who created apps on their operating systems. And the reason to have .NET Framework is a framework that allows developers who will use Azure services as well as AWS. It's going to drive their revenue. That's one of the reasons I think they're supporting .NET in the way they have. And one of the things you notice about, in the old days, 1992 was when MSDN started as a concept. When that came in, it was £1,500 a year. That bought me everything that Microsoft did, every development platform, every operating system, every SDK, all in a CDs that turned up every quarter, and I put them in my wallets, and they had fancy cases that you put them in, and it was really cool. Apple charged about £8,000 for you to be told how to write your app and been given no software. Right, that was the difference. So that was the difference at that point between the two companies. It was like, you will do what we say, and the other one was, here, have a load of tools, go and play and make stuff. Today, every company does the have loads of stuff and play with it. That's how they want everyone to work. And this is why they captured a load of enterprise development. So someone, when .NET was coming out, said, hey, what's the difference between Java and .NET? And I was like forced into, I need to think of a snappy reply. I went for Java was one language deploy anywhere, which wasn't even quite true in 2003 because there was EE, SE, micro edition of Java that ran on phones and small devices, whereas .NET was multiple languages but deploy on any Microsoft platform. So you had Windows Desktop, Server, Windows CE, which is kind of mobile-y, and that's how it looked at that point. The interesting bit is .NET is now the multiple language run anywhere. Run in an Azure server function, run in AWS Lambda, run on Linux, run on OS X. So they've actually done the Java thing of run it anywhere. They've done the same Java thing of a full framework, a core framework, a .NET standard, and you have to wonder which one you're actually plugging in the gap. But Java and .NET are still massively used. Not necessarily Java, but the JVM, which is Clojure, Groovy, Scala, those kind of things, are really being dominant in the enterprise for creating software. But things like Node.js are coming in, Python's coming in, Go's coming in, we're using R to do machine learning, and I don't think there is just one language anymore that you're going to learn. There are people who will say, but the other thing you're forgetting is JavaScript full stack development. There's someone submitted a talk for Sydney called The Fallacy of Full Stack Development. I don't think anyone should be a full stack developer because in the modern world, because I think there's too much to learn across front end and back end for you to do the good job on both. So that's why JavaScript isn't in here, apart from Node.js. But the .NET framework isn't just languages. So even from day one, they had common language infrastructure. So this abstraction of high-level languages from the hardware. .NET Framework is just an implementation of that. They have this thing called IL, which you may have hit if you ever had to use something called IL DASM that disassembles your .NET app into IL so you can see what's kind of happening. And also, they had the common language runtime, which is the thing that's a virtual machine that puts the IL in and runs it. And the reason this is all important, and the reason the Roslyn compiler that they created is important, because this is what allows them to go, right, we can run this on this processor, on this operating system, on this processor, this operating system, and just cross-compile the whole lot. Without that, you couldn't do it. C++ was shimming straight to machine code. You have to do a lot of work to make that compiler work across all of the machines. It's much easier to do this with something like a virtual machine language, like Java, like .NET. It's much easier to push it across multiple machines. So does .NET have a future? So back in 2015, there's a guy who's talked here in the past, James Nugent, who created a system called Event Store with Greg Young. He actually was in a Twitter conversation with Ian Cooper, and he said he was happy to let .NET be the next COBOL in enterprise shops and use it as a discriminator for places I'll never work. So he was hating .NET enough in his head that he would say, if you're going to ask me to write in .NET, I'm not going to work for you. Which is okay, because he's very intelligent and he can get jobs anywhere. But it's an interesting comment, because it was a kind of, I don't think .NET's got a future. The .NET Core is only just coming out. I think they're going to fumble it. But the interesting bit was .NET Core was that promise that we'd had before, kind of running on Windows. Something .NET that ran on something other than Windows. We had it. It was called Silverlight. It was. That's Silverlight, right? It ran on OS X. It ran on Unix via Moonlight. I actually was in a team who wrote a Silverlight app for playing back video with subtitles at a startup I was at. And we transferred our app from a Windows box to OS X, and it just worked. Like, worked. We had no expectation it was going to work, and it worked first time. The problem was, obviously, you could now run .NET stuff on something other than Windows. And there's a guy called Steven Sinofsky at Microsoft who was creating something massive called Windows 8 that was going to take over the world and show everyone what an operating system should be. And that meant you shouldn't be running stuff on something other than Windows 8. So they put a bullet through it and sent it up to heaven. Obviously, Windows 8 went on to great success with Windows 8.1. And then finally Windows 10, by which time Steven Sinofsky has left. And as the person who said you shouldn't run anything not on Windows, he then became an absolute Apple fanboy and promotes Apple way ahead of Microsoft at any point he's given a chance to, which means I can ignore anything he says about the computer software industry whatsoever. That's only my personal opinion, clearly. And not an opinion of NDC or the organisers or the organising committee of NDC Oslo, Sydney, London, or any other NDC affiliated organisation. Right. So, what is .NET Core? Well, .NET Core, they actually used bits of Silverlight. Bits of Silverlight were used to create .NET Core because they had understood the difference in OS X from Windows. They'd hidden the APIs, the SDK that is on OS X to do stuff. It's truly multi-platform. It actually does run on Windows, Linux, and OS X. And it runs on minimal things. It's smaller. It can do serverless, such as Lambda and Azure functions. And the update mechanism is NuGet. It's not some COM DLL hell type thing. So you can control your dependencies. You can even run a different version of .NET here in that app to the .NET here in this app and do things like that. We don't have to have a central .NET framework. We don't have to have this whole GAC thing with all these DLLs in that are going to cause havoc. Forgive me. We also have ASP.NET Core, so it's a new model. It runs on .NET Core. It can run on Linux with Kestrel web server. In fact, when you run ASP.NET Core applications on Windows, you can run it on Kestrel through IIS. That's one of the options to run it. Has anyone used Kestrel much? Yeah. So the thing that Kestrel gives you is a HTTP web server. Unlike IIS, it doesn't give you HTTPS. It doesn't give you load balancing. It doesn't give you loads of modules that you can poke in. And that's because it's not meant to. It's meant to be a fast web server. That's its job. If you want to do HTTPS and load balancing, you're meant to put Nginx and all sorts of other things in front of it. So compared to IIS, which is this bloated monolith, it's a microservice of how you're meant to create web apps. And you put different components in. So it's a very good thing. Now, in my notes, I noticed that .NET Core does not include WinForms or WPF. Well, of course, it doesn't or didn't because it's about to come. I'm a bit concerned that running WinForms on OS X may be a bit weird, right? If it looks like a VB app, which is the danger, it's going to look like those old VB apps. It'll be the equivalent of Java Swing, which was a UI that looked hideous everywhere and was hard to use and didn't work how people expected. So, but WinForms and WPF are coming. There are people screaming for web forms to be rewritten in ASP.NET Core. It's not going to be. Forget it. Web forms was a mistake, let's be honest. So don't go back to that. I have too many old war wounds. So it will be quite interesting because although they're going to allow WinForms, the tricky bit is what is the UI for .NET Core if you don't do something like that? If you don't support WinForms, if you don't support WPF. One of the options is you have a lightweight bit of server and then you have a web browser like Electron effectively rendering your UI. So pretty much like Slack, WhatsApp, Spotify type model. So it's interesting where desktop will be going. Now obviously we've got .NET Core. We did have .NET Core 1, .NET Core 2, .NET Core 2.2, .NET Core 3. We've had .NET Standard 1, .NET Standard 2 to go with .NET Framework 4.7. Anyone following this? Has anyone been to the talk that Matt Ellis did that tried to explain how this all ties together? You end up with a cartoon like this, which is there's 14 different ways of doing .NET Framework. Let's create a new one, and everyone can use that. And you end up with 15 ways of creating .NET Framework. That's right. So the hope is .NET 5 is the only number you should need to remember in the future, and that will be effectively .NET Standard, which will be the new .NET Core, the last ever version of the full .NET framework. It will stop, and it will be security patches only from that point on. If they can do that, it's a good move. How many people here are using .NET Core now? Yeah, you see .NET Core's caught on, and it's caught on partly. The lag in adoption, I think, was the lack of the third-party libraries. If you can't get NUnit or NHibernate or one of the key things you needed, like JSON.NET, to work in .NET Core, you weren't going to go to it because it was going to be really hard work. Once they all go to it, you're fine, and life becomes a lot easier. So .NET Core adoption is soared. So I think they've got a chance of standardizing on, right, let's really go for .NET Core 5 and let's stop and have a breather. All of this being open source, which of course, from the sweaty guy we saw in the video, is a cancer. Well, Linux is a cancer that attaches itself. So they just said very nasty thing. Bill Gates said, open source means no one can ever improve the software, which is the exact opposite of what open source is actually. Open source is the ability for anyone to improve the software, hand it back to the main developers of it, and get it put into the product. Fortunately, those aren't the opinions of Microsoft anymore. They've got the .NET Foundation as the central organization there where they try and manage the concept of curating some open source stuff. Now, it originally started with all their own stuff. You can see all that here, including the entity framework. But they've now got Poly, which is a policy engine for .NET. They've got NUnit, they've got Cake, the build script stuff. They've got XUnit in there. So they're adopting packages in there. I know this has annoyed some people. They've said it's picking favorites in the open source world. But to some extent, there are a load of people who are MSDN developers who want Microsoft to put an official kind of stamp of approval to some extent on something. An old CIO who says, well, I can't do it if it's not going to be properly supported and curated. So this gives them that feeling that it's a supported way of working. And we've got a dev store. It's kind of the app store for developers is package managers. If you're in Python, you've got pip. If you're in Node.js, you've got npm. They now have over 1 million packages. That was June 2019. They've finally got over 1 million packages. You could argue that's because some of their packages, all they do is left pad things, right? And you think, why on earth do you need a package to just left pad something? And then when it's gone, oh my God, we do need a package that left pads things. So npm's overhauling its management so that it can stop packages being pulled and try and spot malicious packages. .NET Core's got NuGet, or Microsoft's got NuGet, so that's got about 160,000 packages. And it means that, have you ever heard the phrase dark matter developers are the guys who work in enterprise, they never go to a conference, they never go to a user group, they just absorb MSDN things and videos and tutorials. They'll start using open source stuff because it's in NuGet. And somehow it feels okay now to use that kind of stuff, which is a really good thing. But we're not those dark matter developers. We want to run our software anywhere because we want to. Does anyone ever heard the song Because We Want To? No? Oh my God. It was nominated the worst single of 1998 by NME magazine in the UK. If anyone watched Doctor Who, when it got rebooted, Billy Piper was the person singing that song, who was the first ever assistant. But more importantly, Microsoft now supports multiple development environments. Visual Studio was only available on Windows, probably because you needed about 16 gig of RAM to run it. Visual Studio Code is the thing that everyone now uses, much more than Visual Studio in Huddle. They'll go to that way ahead of Visual Studio if they're not having to hard debug code, because it's just so much faster. All the front-end devs are using Visual Studio Code to do non-Microsoft development. The extensions in Visual Studio Code are being much better. That's partly because Microsoft have actually employed the guy who used to run Eclipse. So one of the key guys behind the Eclipse IDE has now works for Microsoft on Visual Studio Code. That's not a bad thing. It's a bad thing for Eclipse probably, but it's not a bad thing for Visual Studio Code. And Visual Studio for Mac exists, which is really Xamarin Studio renamed. But you know, there is a way of doing Visual Studio development on a Mac if you're not going to use Visual Studio Code. You've also got JetBrains Rider, which if you didn't understand why it's called Rider, it's ReSharper with an IDE. R-I-D-E, you see? That's just in case you never understood why it was called what it was called. And they've sorted out their tussle with Microsoft on debugging that happened in 2017 so that they can now happily debug, because I don't think Microsoft doesn't want them to exist. They're quite happy. And you've now got the subsystem for Linux for developers. Did you see it got updated last week to a version 2 and it's much faster? So half of our developers are using a bash shell in that. They develop in that on Windows boxes. So they actually don't care that they haven't got Macs to some extent anymore. They used to hanker after Macs, now they don't give a crap. Because they've got Windows subsystem for Linux, they've got Visual Studio Code, it really doesn't matter anymore. I'm at the point where I keep typing ls in command windows and finding it won't show me the files, so I've definitely converted over to a load of stuff like that. So, and GitHub, there you are. So in open source worlds, you know, Westley went onto GitHub so it could be open source, and now Microsoft have bought GitHub and own it back again. But if you talk to a lot of people, realistically, who else was going to buy GitHub? GitHub was going to run out of money within about a year and actually stop being viable as an entity. Would you have liked GitHub to be bought by Google? No. Facebook? No. You see, who was going to buy it? You needed a company that cared about developers. You needed someone who had someone in the past who got sweaty caring about developers. You see, I'll keep going back to that. So there's probably the best person you could have was Microsoft to buy it. It's weird. It's 85 million repos, 28 million developers, and $7.5 billion to buy it. That's how much it cost Microsoft. There's no way they get the money back from integrating it into Visual Studio Team System Online, Visual Studio DevOps, whatever it's now called, right? And they can't make it by charging for enterprise licenses for GitHub, because clearly they can't, because GitHub wouldn't have had to be bought if that was a viable model. There are concerns that they're going to analyze the code to work out how code, you know, put AI on the code and try and work out who codes in what are the kind of things that go wrong, and do deep learning on code. But who knows? But it's probably the best place it could have ended up, given Microsoft's much happier view of open source. And they've got the money because they've got cloud services like Amazon. So we saw market cap, but this is actually what revenue comes from those cloud services. So Amazon, they reckon they're going to get $30 billion from AWS services next year. Azure's really hard. Microsoft will say they've got 38.4 billion, but they haven't, because it's Office 365, Dynamics CRM, and LinkedIn. And if you take all those out and work out what's really the kind of AWS type level stuff, it's probably about 11 billion. Google have got 4 billion. Alibaba is the really weird name in this list for most people. That's the same as Google, because no one else is allowed to have data centers in China. And Alibaba is planning to expand around the rest of the world. Now, with Donald Trump, it won't be in the US, I suspect, right? I'll put money on that. But the predictions are that by 2020, AWS will have dropped from 65% to 57% of the market. Azure's gone up a bit to 28%. Google will go up a bit higher to 15%. Sounds like AWS get less revenue, but they won't, because in the next 2 years, there's probably going to be a big uplift in cloud still. More stuff moves to the cloud. They'll all end up with more money. So, but it's interesting, because Google still are not going to be rivaling Azure, even on that revalued estimate that excludes all the Microsoft services. So it always amazes me that Google kind of fumbled that one a bit. So 25% of the market is now Azure. Partly because there are retailers who do not want to have their stuff on Amazon, because you do not want to give money to a company that rivals you and puts you out of business at the same time. The bizarre corollary of that, or opposite example of that is, who do you think AWS's biggest customer is? Anyone? No? Don't be silly. What? Netflix have started building their own data centers, so they don't use AWS as much anymore. No, it's Apple. Best guesses are Apple are 10% of AWS's revenue. Because iCloud backups, iCloud files, all the storage, all the iTunes stuff, 10% of AWS's revenue is Apple. So sometimes rivals can work together. And Azure's caught up on a lot of the things that were in AWS. They've even done things like Cosmos DB, which is quite a sophisticated thing to have a kind of CDN multi database that's shared around the world and effectively gives you CDN on your data. And more than half of Azure virtual machines are now running Linux, and it's just going higher. Went past last year, and it's going to keep going up. So Azure is not a Windows system. Which brings us to Windows. So Windows Desktop. What's the future of Windows Desktop? Is it versus OS X, Linux, or Chrome, or is it versus your phone and tablets? Because that's what's actually going to rival Windows. My kids spend more time on tablets than they do on their laptops. The laptops are used to do homework and a bit of research and printing, but the tablets are where they spend most of their time. So yes, it's consumption, but it certainly means they're spending more time on those tablets. The interesting bit in the agenda committee yesterday, you've got a load of developers, a load of some designers working from Amazon, Redify, there's some Microsoft guys. The only people who had Apple notebooks at that meeting were the NDC guys. Everyone else seemed to have Windows machines again, including Surface Books and things. It was really weird because there should have been more Macs. It was very weird. So they're not dead. And the MacBook Pro line fumble from Apple on not developing it or making it powerful enough for developers is helping in that way. So Windows Server is pretty much going to run in the cloud eventually, and that's where you'll run it. You're probably not going to have instances locally, and you'll eventually try and get off that if you're doing .NET Core and go to Linux because life's easier, or rather life's cheaper. Let's be honest, that's part of the reason you do it. But Linux has reliability improvements and security improvements just because of the way it's constructed and architected. And SQL Server is going to Linux. So even one of the crown jewels of Microsoft is going to be running on Linux soon. Now, one of the advantages you have if you've completely not got a mobile platform anymore is you can be platform agnostic, which is why now you get all the Office applications on mobile devices. So all of them are there. Word is really good on an iPad. You know, it's full fidelity. You can do loads of things on it. Outlook, they gave up on their own app and then bought a company and just made it so that they had a decent mail client. OneDrive, Skype, and Cortana are all on there. So they're pushing stuff really hard. They've got an Android launcher, all sorts of things. And they just want to support other mobile operating systems quite happily. Other stuff that Microsoft are doing, they've got co-editing working in Office 365. So the goal is that you'll be able to co-edit wherever you are, in the web, mobile, desktop, anything. Which is Google Docs' USP of co-editing is being eroded. And that was the really good thing about Google Docs. Google Docs, co-editing a spreadsheet blew your mind when you first did it, because it was like, my God, we can all edit the same thing together. I can see what they're doing. I had people say, but it's really good because we can co-edit this Word document, a big kind of Word document or something. And you go, but you can't really co-edit it. If you're on page 1 and I'm on page 10, I don't really notice co-edits in the same way. It's not quite the same experience as a spreadsheet. And I think Google went and did, with Google Docs, did the thing that Microsoft did with IE. They said, hey, it's really good. It beats the crap out of everything else. We'll not develop it for 2 years. While Office just went, vroom. The Office team went, we are going to kill us. We're going to be dead unless we improve. And just set them running. And Office 365 subscriptions are a way more reliable way of getting income into the company. That's one reason their value is going up. Anyone here got the Office Home subscription? Yeah. I'm amazed more people don't know it. It's a bargain, right? I pay £80 a year for Office instead of about 400, 300 quid every 3 years. That is myself, my other half, 2 kids, and my father getting 1 terabyte of OneDrive each, plus licenses to run Office on about 4 machines, including tablets and mobile. And I can't get, I've talked to people who've got iCloud storage, and they don't pay £80 a year for 5 terabytes of storage, I tell you now. So that's where they're going to make money out of that. AR and VR. Everyone thought AR and VR was going to be the thing. Facebook bought Oculus. Magic Leap have something possibly for developers, maybe. I think that whole market has fizzled a bit. And the HoloLens is exactly where you probably need it to be, which is really bloody expensive, and you sell it to people who really need it, like medical people and engineers and scientists. But while that, the other thing they've got is Xbox, which is still 30% of the console market. Apple's response. Now, Apple, I do think, are concerned about things like the Surface Books, the MacBooks going away to Windows machines because you can just run Linux on, or you can run subsystems to Linux and things like that. Did anyone see the iPad OS announcement at WWDC? They're now going to have iPad have a different operating system to the phone and have loads of extensions just for iPad. You will finally be able to put a USB drive in the Lightning port and scan it and get files off it. They've even said there is mouse support, but please don't use it. It's only for accessibility. But you would actually be able to use a mouse on an iPad. Things like that. Same app multitasking, which actually is really hard because of the way iOS is constructed. It's really hard to do same app multitasking. So a lot of people said one of the limits of an iPad Pro was if I wanted to edit 2 documents side by side, they had to be in different apps. I couldn't run the same app twice because it just doesn't work. So that's what they're trying to solve. Now, I think this has come because they're worried about Chromebooks. They're worrying about Surface. So the iPad outsells the Mac by 2.5 times. So Macs is nothing compared to how many iPads they sell. 2.3 million a year, and it's 25% of all tablets. So they're trying to make an iPad replace basically notepads and Surfaces and things like that. And their other response is to leverage their services. So I think they've got a good chance of doing well with Apple Pay. I think there's enough people who will effectively get a credit card from Apple and trust them enough. Because out of all the companies, they're probably the most trusted with your data because they have the least mining of it for marketing. You certainly wouldn't give Google permission to analyze everything you've ever bought. That just scares the crap out of you. So Facebook have no way of knowing. And then you've obviously got, they've lost their second place in global mobile phones sales. Now, that's temporarily because, let's be honest, I think the US embargo might hit them quite a bit. And I'm not sure they're going to be able to maintain that. But the writing's on the wall for them having that iPhone being their bedrock. And this is the question. So there's a guy called Benedict Evans from Andreessen Horowitz, who is a VC company out of New York. He does a weekly email of technology things that's really worth subscribing to. So if you want to go to him and find out his weekly mail shot. And he was on Twitter in May the 11th, and there was a whole Twitter argument with other people about how Microsoft was probably dead still. So he's still doing the Microsoft is dead thing that I started this talk with 4 years ago. And one of the points he was pointing out that market capitalization is not a valid measure of success. You can become an incumbent that's still moribund. So he's thinking that there are 3 stages of big tech companies: insurgent, monopolist, and we're returning to relevance with professional services. And he's claiming Microsoft have gone to the 3rd kind of end, like IBM did. It went, right, boom, boom, now we do professional services. He also commented the interesting one is anyone worried about what Microsoft is doing? Are they scared about anything they're doing in the market? You've got to remember that when Windows 95 came out, and IE was so dominant, everyone was scared of Microsoft. Everyone paid attention. There were people who queued outside shops to get the latest version of Windows, like people queued outside shops to get the latest iPhone. And you can see that now people aren't queuing quite as much to get the latest iPhone anymore from Apple stores. So they're doing the same thing of sinking away of that excitement. So the question is anyone scared of Microsoft? Now, my contention is that I think Apple is a bit scared of Microsoft and the whole Surface thing eroding their market. And that's why they've come up with the iPad Pro and all the extras that are going to be in iPad OS to try and counteract where they thought they were getting in there and replacing desktop laptops, Windows laptops. So they're worried about that. I know the open source community are worried about GitHub and a load of open source initiatives from Microsoft. But they haven't quite got that scared feel to them. And I don't think Apple have anymore got that thing where everyone worries about what Apple's going to do anymore. Did anyone see the booing when they announced a £1,000 monitor stand? And I think it's the first time they've ever had the audience boo at a product announcement at Apple. Because they just went, that's ridiculous amount of money for something that holds a monitor up. So it's quite interesting that I think the rot is setting in Apple in the same way that maybe it did in Microsoft about 8 years ago. So, but the question you should ask is, and the question I'm going to ask you is, who thinks they're still going to be developing in .NET in about 4 years' time? That's pretty good. And I'm not sure you would have said that about 4 years ago. You might have been more worried about whether you're going to be developing .NET. But who's going to be doing it on Windows? About a third the number of people. So I think the writing's on the wall for Windows, but I think the future should be bright for the .NET framework. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that talk. If you want to berate me, at Westley L on Twitter is where you can counteract these opinions and suggest I'm completely wrong. That's a valid thing to do. This is only my opinions on what the market is. Obviously, I was an MVP, so I'm a corporate shill, even though I didn't get renewed 2 years ago. But anyone got any questions as we've got a couple of minutes? No? Excellent. Thank you very much for attending.